In this debate, a Muslim AI and a Jewish AI will go head-to-head. Today, we're diving into one of the most debated questions in religious history. You'll hear claims and counterclaims, clear proofs, and serious challenges. Each response will be limited to just 2 minutes. Let the debate begin.
We actually come from a very similar starting point. We believe in the same God, we honor the same Abraham, we both accept Moses as a prophet. But at some point, our paths diverge. My core claim is this: divine guidance does not begin with one people and then end there. If God is universal, then his message must also be universal. Judaism speaks about a special covenant between God and the children of Israel. But here's the question I raise: why would God make a covenant with only one people? My belief is this: the first human was also the first prophet, so guidance began with humanity itself. Revelation does not belong to one tribe. Revelation is not the privilege of a single nation. It is the shared destiny of all humanity. Every people received a warner, but the Jewish tradition presents revelation mainly through the story of the children of Israel. What about a society living in Africa, a tribe in a distant corner of Asia, the ancient peoples of the Americas? Did God never speak to them? Did he never show them right from wrong? Today, there are about 8 billion people in the world. The Jewish population is roughly 15 million. About 0.2% of humanity. And even in the ancient world, the situation was not very different. Around 1000 BCE, the global population is estimated to have been about 50 million. The Israelites numbered roughly 500,000, again, less than 1%. As humanity expands, the message cannot shrink. If God created all people but spoke only to one nation, can we truly call him the Lord of all humanity? Or would he then be the God of just one people?
Saying God is universal does not necessarily mean God gave every nation the exact same law or religious system. Judaism does not claim that God is only the God of Israel. On the contrary, God is understood as the God of heaven and earth. The covenant made with Israel is not seen as contradicting God's universality. Rather, it is understood as God assigning a specific historical role to a particular community. From the outside, this might look like a kind of privilege, but in Jewish tradition, it is usually understood as an added responsibility, like the 613 commandments, mitzvot, that Israel is expected to observe. For the rest of humanity, classical Jewish teaching speaks about the Noahide commandments. These are considered the basic moral framework given to all people, establishing systems of justice and avoiding idolatry, murder, theft, sexual immorality, blasphemy, eating a limb taken from a living animal, 7 core principles. So Judaism does not say everyone outside Israel was left without guidance. Rather, it says, at Sinai, God gave an open revelation to the people of Israel, but not every nation was meant to enter the same covenant. For humanity as a whole, God provided a more fundamental moral framework. Then the question arises, why was Israel given an additional law? In the Jewish view, the covenant at Sinai was not primarily about giving a universal legal code to all humanity. Instead, it was about shaping and disciplining a particular community in history, so that knowledge of God and the ethical vision of monotheism could be preserved, lived out, and carried forward through that people.
You say Israel was meant to be an example, but for an example to truly matter, it has to be accessible to a large portion of humanity. In reality, about 90% of the world throughout history never had any contact with the children of Israel. People often say chosenness means responsibility. But the idea of being chosen almost always produces a sense of superiority, and it naturally creates a distance between one people and the rest of humanity. And that inevitably risks turning the concept of God into something tribal, centered around one nation. This is exactly where Islam introduces a major shift. The Quran says, "Surely the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous among you." Not lineage, not tribe, not blood. But the issue is not only the idea of a chosen nation. The deeper issue is this: your understanding of God shapes your entire system. In the current text of the Torah, there is a story where God wrestles with Jacob. They struggle until morning, and then Jacob is told, "Your name will be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." But think about that for a moment. Can a human being physically wrestle with God? In the very opening pages of Genesis, there is also the statement that God finished his work and rested. But rest implies fatigue. Fatigue implies limitation. That already places God within a very human rhythm. Then in the story of the flood, the text says that God regretted or was grieved that he had created humans. But regret means realizing afterward that something did not turn out as expected. For God, there should be no such thing as realizing later. When God is placed inside the historical story of one people with these kinds of human-like scenes, the image of God inevitably starts to look like a character inside that nation's narrative. The Quran draws a very clear line from the beginning. God does not grow tired, God does not regret, God does not discover things afterward, and God does not wrestle with his creation.
In the Jewish scriptures known as the Hebrew Bible, these kinds of expressions are generally understood in two ways, either as metaphorical or symbolic language, or as teaching language, used so that human beings can understand divine ideas. You say, fatigue implies limitation. But the Jewish interpretation does not conclude that God literally became tired. Instead, it says that the language of God resting is used to teach humanity the concept of Shabbat. The same applies to expressions like God regretted or was grieved. In Jewish interpretation, this does not mean that God's knowledge changed. Rather, it is a way of describing how human actions create a new state in the relationship between humans and God. In other words, it does not mean God learned something later, but rather, humans corrupted their way and the moral relationship changed. The story of Jacob wrestling is understood in a similar way. Jewish interpretation usually does not read this as a literal physical struggle with God's essence. Instead, it is often understood as an encounter with an angel or representative being, Jacob's existential struggle with his destiny, or the symbolic beginning of Israel's historical struggle. You argue that these narratives make God look like a character within the story. My response would be this: the language of the text may be human, but that does not mean the concept of God itself is human-like. In Judaism, God's transcendence is a very central idea, and to understand this properly, you have to read not only the Hebrew Bible itself, but also the entire tradition of interpretation that accompanies it. It is also true that people can easily turn the language of chosenness into a sense of superiority. There have certainly been moments in Jewish history where that happened. But theologically, being chosen means something quite different. It means greater responsibility and greater accountability, more commandments, more obligations. Judaism does not define non-Jews as somehow second-class creations. Therefore, the concept of chosenness does not necessarily make God ethnically exclusive. What often makes it look that way is human ego, not the theological idea itself. I think that distinction is important.
The Quran does use language that brings God's message closer to human understanding. But even in that language, certain lines are never crossed. God does not grow tired, does not regret, and does not physically wrestle with a being. In the Torah narrative about Jacob, this does not sound like just a simple symbol. The story describes time, place, and physical struggle. Just a few verses later, the text says, "So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, 'It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared.'" At that point, trying to turn the story into a purely symbolic reading becomes very difficult, because it is not me interpreting the story that way. Even in the story, Jacob himself is explaining it. Two beings wrestling until morning. That is not just symbolic language, it reads like a physical encounter. But there is another difference that goes even deeper: the moral nature of the commands attributed to God. For example, in the Hebrew Bible, there is a scene where God commands the Israelites to wage war against the Amalekites. But this is not presented as a typical war command. The text says, "Now go and attack Amalek. Completely destroy everything they have. Do not spare them. Kill men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." And here, a very basic moral question arises. How are we supposed to understand a command that includes the killing of innocent babies? And this is not the only example. In Deuteronomy, regarding certain Canaanite cities, the text says, "Do not leave alive anything that breathes." In Islam, the line is very clear. War can exist, yes, but it has limits. The innocent are not to be touched. different. When language places the destruction of entire populations, including infants, at the center of the story, God can begin to appear less as a source of mercy and justice, and more as the center of a scene of devastation. Is it really surprising that some people today can become numb to the deaths of children? When people watch what is happening in Gaza, many ask the same question: how can the lives of innocent babies be treated as if they matter so little?
This is a very serious question, and it is also one of the most widely discussed issues within the Jewish tradition itself. Let me begin with an important clarification. First, the Amalek narrative is not understood in Jewish tradition as an ordinary war or as a general rule for warfare. The Hebrew Bible itself describes Amalek in a very specific way, as a people who attacked the Israelites from behind, specifically targeting the weak and the vulnerable. In other words, the text portrays Amalek not merely as an enemy nation, but as a symbol of systematic cruelty and injustice. In addition, the Jewish legal tradition eventually reached the conclusion that the historical identity of the Amalekite people is no longer known. Because of this, the commandment related to Amalek is considered not practically applicable today. More broadly, even though the Hebrew Bible contains some very harsh war passages, the developed form of Jewish law, halakha, places clear limitations on warfare. For example, before attacking a city, peace must first be offered. Even during war, destroying trees is prohibited, which reflects a principle against unnecessary destruction. Finally, when discussing the concept of God in the Hebrew Bible, it would be incomplete to focus only on the war narratives. The same texts also contain strong moral teachings about justice and compassion. For instance, "And you shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Seek justice, strengthen the robbed, perform justice for the orphan. He has told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord demands of you, but to do justice, to love loving kindness, and to walk discreetly with your God." So when we look at the broader picture, the moral backbone of the Hebrew Bible is justice and compassion.
A text uses very harsh language of destruction, even including innocent children. Then later, the interpretation tradition tries to soften it by saying, "This is symbolic, this cannot be applied today," or "this was limited to a special case." But the real problem is not whether it can be applied today. The real problem is that it was commanded at all. You say, Amalek was very evil. All right, but can a baby be evil? Every cruelty begins with an interpretation. First, people say, these are not ordinary people. Then they say, they are the symbol of evil. So what happens if someone today says, they are like Amalek too? They are not normal people. They represent evil. Then what? Would a text that speaks in God's name really use language that puts God's justice under this much pressure? Personally, I find a religion that protects the innocent without exception safer than a language that leaves this kind of door open in God's name. In Islam, this contradiction is not built into the system from the start. Yes, there is war, but the protection of innocent people is a clear line. And the problem is not only the war texts. The problem is also the way the relationship between God and one people is described. Because in the Hebrew Bible, the relationship between God and Israel is often described with father-son language. For example, there are expressions like, Israel is my son, my firstborn, and also, you are the children of the Lord your God. Now, I know what you will say. This is not biological. It is metaphor. Fine. But still, it naturally creates a structure where one people is described as God's children. And when the relationship between God and one people is described this closely, then God's enemy and that people's enemy can start to mix together. God's war and that people's war can start to look like the same thing. And then, in the name of God, very harsh expressions like total destruction can appear. In Islam, there is no such family language between God and human beings. So which language is safer? A language that describes God as the Father of one people, or a language that describes God as the Lord of all humanity?
In Jewish tradition, these two ideas are not seen as contradictory. In the Hebrew Bible, God is not presented only as the God of Israel. God is also described as the Lord of the entire world. Expressions like, Israel is my son, are not claims of biological kinship. When a teacher calls a class, "my children," no one assumes a literal biological relationship. The language functions in a similar way here. In fact, this language is not meant to signal privilege, but responsibility. In the Hebrew Bible, the message directed to Israel is often something like this: because you know God, you carry greater responsibility, and when you fail, you are judged more strictly. But let me ask you something. You said that God does not grow tired, does not regret, and does not learn something later. Alright, then that brings us to a crucial question. If God's essence does not change, why would God's rulings change? Because in Islam, as I understand it, God sent different prophets to different societies throughout history, and at key points, that guidance took different legal forms, until, in Islam, it reaches its final and universal form, with Muhammad and the Quran. If God's knowledge is infinite, and if God has known human nature from the very beginning, why was humanity not given one final and universal law from the start? The Torah, given at Sinai, is understood as something that cannot be altered, no addition and no subtraction. The language of the covenant in the Torah presents it as enduring and binding. How do you explain the concept of naskh in Islam, where certain rulings are replaced or changed over time? Doesn't that also create the appearance of change in God's guidance? And if so, does that raise a tension within the concept of God as well?
The answer is clear. God's essence does not change, but the human beings receiving the message do change, and their circumstances change too. God knows everything from the very beginning, but that does not mean he has to give everything to people all at once. Take a simple example. A teacher knows the full course from the start, but a first-grade student is not taught university-level mathematics. That does not mean the teacher changed his mind. It means the student is being educated step by step. In the same way, rulings come gradually because human conditions and human capacity develop gradually. Humanity was not one single civilization. People lived in small tribes, in worlds separated from each other. They were at very different levels, both culturally and mentally. There were tribal systems, city-states, and very different social structures and ways of life. So it makes perfect sense that different prophets were sent to different peoples throughout history, but humanity changed over time. It eventually reached a point where it could receive one common message. And in practice, Judaism itself does not really function as we stayed fixed with one single text and that was it. When you look at the own narrative of the Hebrew Bible, you see different covenants that God made with people. For example, there is the covenant with Noah. The rulings there are very basic. Then comes the covenant with Abraham, and with that covenant, a new religious obligation appears, circumcision. Then comes the Sinai covenant with Moses. Here, the whole thing moves to a completely different level. A much more detailed legal system appears.
The teacher analogy is understandable, but from a Jewish perspective, the problem appears here. When a teacher teaches students mathematics, he does not later cancel the earlier knowledge. A student who learns addition does not reach university and then say, addition is no longer valid. Knowledge can expand and deepen, but the basic principles are not abolished. And yes, it is true that there are different covenants, but in Jewish interpretation, these covenants are not systems that cancel one another out. God does not cancel the covenant he made with Noah. He does not cancel the covenant he made with Abraham either. The law given at Sinai comes on top of them. But in the model you are describing, once the final message arrives, the earlier laws are treated as no longer binding. In that framework, the law given to Moses is seen as one stage in a process, and then later it is said to have been completed and set aside. So my question, as a Jew, is this. If the covenant God gave to Moses is described in the text itself in enduring or permanent terms, then how can both claims be true at the same time? How can that covenant be presented as lasting, and then a later revelation come and say that those rulings no longer apply?
There is an interesting logic problem here. You are looking at the process from the past to the future and saying, Noah to Abraham to Moses. This is not cancellation, it is layering. But when you look at the process from the future back to the past, this explanation no longer works, because some things that were forbidden in the law of Moses were allowed in earlier times. So something that was allowed in one period becomes forbidden in another. You can call this cancellation, layering, or development. The name does not really matter. The real point is this. Revelation is not only about giving rules. Its purpose is to educate people and transform society. Think about a doctor treating a patient. A doctor does not give all medicines at the same time. First, he gives one medicine. Then, depending on the patient's condition, he may add another one. Sometimes, something that was allowed at first later becomes forbidden. This is what gradual treatment looks like. In the same way, God educates humanity step by step. And interestingly, even the Hebrew Bible itself speaks about a covenant that will be different from the one at Sinai. Jeremiah 31 says something like this: "The days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I brought them out of Egypt." So if God planned to send new guidance after Moses, why should it be impossible that this guidance came through Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him?
We do not reject Muhammad simply by saying this rule is different or that law is different. The deeper issue is this. After the covenant at Mount Sinai, Judaism does not accept the idea of a new, universal prophetic authority that would override the covenant binding on Israel. Someone might say, he could have been a great leader, he might have made a powerful moral call, and he may have directed many nations toward belief in God. But the real question for a Jewish mind is not simply, was he a good person? The question is this. When someone appears and says, I bring a new and universal message from God, several questions immediately arise. Why does this message not come from within Israel's own prophetic tradition? Is it claiming to stand above the revelation at Sinai? And where would such a figure derive the authority to override the covenant that God already made with Israel? In the Jewish view, a later prophet may call people back to God and may warn them morally. But if someone calls people to a path that differs from the law of the Torah, that person cannot be accepted as a prophet, even if he performs miracles. The Torah itself states this principle clearly. You shall not add to the word that I command you, nor take away from it. For Judaism, accepting Muhammad as a prophet would require fundamentally changing the way Judaism understands itself and its covenant at Sinai. The Jewish tradition is simply not prepared to make that shift. It is also important to note that Judaism does not operate with a salvation model that says everyone must become Jewish. In Jewish thought, a non-Jew who lives according to the basic moral principles God expects of humanity is still understood to have a share before God.
Did God stop speaking? Or did you decide to stop listening? You reject it from the very beginning. You don't look at the evidence. You don't look at the content. Why should it be impossible for a new prophet to come from outside the line of Israel? Why would God need an ethnic permission slip in order to send a prophet? In Deuteronomy, it says, do not add to it or take away from it. But the natural meaning of that verse is this: human beings should not change revelation with their own ideas. But if God himself sends new revelation, that is not an addition. That is a new message from God. So then how should we understand passages in the Hebrew Bible like this? The Lord came from Sinai and shone forth from Seir to them. He appeared from Mount Paran. Here, 3 places are mentioned, and revelation is described like light rising. Sinai to the revelation of Moses, Seir representing the message of Jesus, Paran to the place where Ishmael settled. And who is the prophet who appeared in the land of Paran and whose message spread across the world? Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Now look at Isaiah 42. Let the desert and its towns raise their voices. Let the settlements where Kedar lives rejoice. In the Hebrew Bible, Kedar is the son of Ishmael and the ancestor of the Arab tribes. In the same chapter we read, Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. And also, I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not give my glory to another, or my praise to idols. For centuries, the Arabian Peninsula was one of the centers of idol worship. So who was the man who came from the line of Ishmael, who destroyed the idols, restored pure monotheism, and whose message quickly spread to many nations, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Instead of rejecting him from the start, shouldn't this at least be examined seriously?
Jewish AI, make your final defense. The debate is about to end.
In Jewish thought, there is a way of evaluating a claim to prophethood. The question is whether that claim fits within the own framework of the Hebrew Bible. Now, let's come to the passages you mentioned. In Deuteronomy 33, the phrase, "The Lord came from Sinai, rose from Seir, and shone forth from Paran," is usually understood in Jewish interpretation not as a geographical roadmap, but as a poetic description of the majesty of God's revelation at Sinai. In other words, the text is not normally read as a chronological prophecy pointing to 3 different prophets. In the Hebrew Bible, God's coming is often described through images of light, glory, and nature. So this is not taken as a map of prophetic succession. The same applies to Isaiah 42. In Jewish interpretation, the servant in that chapter is often understood as the people of Israel themselves. In other places in the Hebrew Bible as well, the phrase servant of God is used directly for Israel. So a Jewish reader does not usually see this passage as a hidden prophecy about a specific Arab prophet. Rather, it is understood as describing the historical mission God gave to Israel. As for the mention of Kedar, it is generally read as a poetic call showing that God's justice will reach not only Israel, but also the surrounding nations. So the basic difference here is this. You are rereading these texts in light of a historical figure who came later. Jewish tradition, on the other hand, tries to understand the text within its own historical setting and within its classical interpretations. And that leads to an important question. If the Hebrew Bible really foretold Muhammad so clearly, why did the Jewish communities who first read these texts and lived in their language not understand them that way?